Ignoring the words of Jesus has led to the introduction of tragic error into Orthodox Christian theology. Reducing Jesus' words to window dressing before his all-important death has an equally insidious effect on the behavior of people who call themselves Christians. This point was hammered home to me recently while sitting in church listening to yet another sermon about how the world has gone to hell in a handbasket. The pastor asserted that people are by and large more immoral than they were at some unspecified time in the past. He bemoaned the evaporation of societal shame, which in better times served to modify the behavior of potential sinners. And moving on to politics, he spoke out against the lack of moral fiber in our elected leaders. Anyone who attends an evangelical church or listens to mainstream Christian media is bombarded with the notion that the world is a more immoral place than it was in the past. And it is getting worse all the time. I've heard this so much since I began attending evangelical churches some 35 years ago that my brain normally lets it pass by without notice, chalking it up to simple-minded generic pining for the good old days. But in truth, such grumbling is not a harmless pastime, not among Christians who have been commanded by God to cast aside their human nature and follow the example of Christ. Not only are the ideas wrong and therefore promoting untruths, but the attitudes involved contradict the attitude and actions of Jesus, who should be our example. Biblical support for the idea that the world will grow gradually worse often comes from quoting 1 Timothy chapter 3, in which Paul declares that there will be terrible times in the last days, and lists a litany of sins that people will commit in such times. But it is far from clear that Paul was referring to any particular year in this current generation, as many would believe. The idea also is contradicted by any rational review of history. When was this magical time when people were better than they are today? Was it earlier this century when good Christians in the southern U.S. used to pack lunches on their way to lynchings? Was it the last century when men killed each other by the tens of thousands in the Civil War? Was it in centuries past when Protestants and Catholics warred in Europe, when reading the Bible was illegal and John Calvin burned heretics? Was it during the Crusades? Was it in the Middle Ages when people converted to Christianity at the point of a sword? Was it in antiquity when much of the populace was enslaved and many religions had official prostitutes? The disconnect between church behavior and Jesus' words is most clear with the issue of war and peace. Evangelical churches in the U.S. today are by and large nationalistic and militaristic, but this does not reflect the ideals of Jesus, who spoke frequently about nonviolence. The meek will inherit the earth. The peacemakers will be called the sons of God. Love your enemies. Do not resist those who aim to harm you, a principle which he followed to his death. Now, it can be logically argued that a nation is better off not adhering to nonviolent principles, but that can never be the Christian principle, because Jesus calls us to be like him, not the world. Reviewing 2 books about Iraq in the New York Review of Books, senior war correspondent Chris Hedges describes war in profound terms. The vanquished know war. They see through the empty jingoism of those who use the abstract words of glory, honor, and patriotism to mask the cries of the wounded, the senseless killing, war profiteering, and chest-pounding grief. They know the lies the victors often do not acknowledge, the lies covered up in stately war memorials and mythic war narratives filled with stories of courage and comradeship. They know the lies that permeate the thick, self-important memoirs by amoral statesmen who make wars but do not know war. The vanquished know the essence of war, death. They grasp that war is necrophilia. They see that war is a state of almost pure sin with its goals of hatred and destruction. They know how war fosters alienation, leads inevitably to nihilism, and is a turning away from the sanctity and preservation of life. All other narratives about war too easily fall prey to the allure and seductiveness of violence, as well as the attraction of the godlike power that comes with the license to kill with impunity. But the words of the vanquished come later, sometimes long after the war, when grown men and women unpack the suffering they endured as children, what it was like to see their mother or father killed or taken away, or what it was like to lose their homes, their community, their security, and be discarded as human refuse. But by then, few listen. The truth about war comes out, but usually too late. We are assured by the war makers that these stories have no bearing on the glorious violent enterprise the nation is about to inaugurate. And, lapping up the myth of war and its sense of empowerment, we prefer not to look. The bottom line is that the church takes on the characteristics of its teaching. If people are taught that the most important aspects of Jesus' life are his birth, death, and resurrection, and not his words, they will certainly fail to follow his instructions and the example of the life he lived. That leaves an almost incomprehensible situation in which millions of people claim the name of Jesus, yet act completely contrary to the lifestyle he both espoused and lived. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven.